HOA Karen kept throwing trash in my yard, so I installed a camera that streams to the HOA group chat. I'm so glad you're here. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're listening to my story of revenge from. I want to know how far it has reached. For 20 years, I had lived on this street like its quiet guardian. Every blade of grass in my yard had a purpose. Every flower bed reflected my discipline, and every morning began with the sound of sprinklers and the pride of order. It was not just a neighborhood to me. It was an ecosystem that demanded care. The hedges were trimmed to equal height, the mailboxes perfectly aligned, and every trash bin returned to its place by noon. I believed in community standards, in respect for shared space, in the dignity of presentation. That belief was tested the day she moved in. She arrived in a flurry of noise and clutter, a moving truck rattling the calm rhythm of our cul-de-sac. Within hours, her children were running across lawns, and her bins stood open, spilling plastic and paper like a storm had passed through. I watched from my porch, clutching my coffee, feeling something inside me tighten. It wasn't hatred, not yet. It was a warning, the first scent of chaos creeping through the order I had spent years protecting. The next morning, I walked out with my gloves to water the flowers, and there it was, a fast food bag, half-crushed soda cans, greasy napkins pressed against my roses. The sight stopped me cold. I looked at her yard, then at mine, and understood this was not an accident. At first, I wanted to believe in coincidence. Maybe the wind had carried it over. Maybe the garbage collectors had left it loose. I picked it up without a word, tied the bag, and went back inside. But by the third morning, when the same pile appeared again, this time mixed with coffee filters and orange peels, I knew it was deliberate. She was testing boundaries. The woman next door had found her first opponent. I wrote an email to the HOA, detailing every incident with timestamps, dates, and attached photos. I even mentioned the environmental implications. When the board replied, it was a single sentence. "We'll look into it." They never did. That silence burned more than the litter itself. Each day the situation worsened. She started leaving her bins half open, sometimes right against the property line. Stray wrappers danced across the lawn like mockery. Her children laughed as they kicked empty bottles toward my fence. I stood behind my curtains and watched it all, the slow invasion of filth creeping toward my doorstep. I had always believed in civility, in reason, in talking things through. But civility is wasted when the other side thrives on provocation. I felt invisible, powerless in the very community I had once helped build. I had chaired meetings, organized cleanups, even won Yard of the Year 5 summers in a row. Yet now I was the woman no one listened to. I tried writing her a note, neatly folded, taped to her door. I kept it polite, even kind, a simple reminder to keep her bin secure, to think of her neighbors. She read it while standing on her porch, then crumpled it and tossed it straight into her overflowing bin. That gesture cut deeper than any insult. It told me she didn't care, not about me, not about this place, not about the rules that kept us decent. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the sound of the crumpled paper hitting the plastic bag. It echoed in my head like a challenge. The next morning, I walked outside early, just as the sun touched the tops of the roofs. The air was still, clean for once, until I looked down. A single banana peel rested on my driveway, fresh and yellow like a signature. I stared at it for a long time before picking it up. That was when I decided that if the HOA would not defend order, I would. Someone had to. Every community needs a keeper of standards, and if that made me the villain in their eyes, then so be it. My gloves, my clipboard, my photos, these became my weapons. I started documenting every infraction, not just hers but others too, building a case for control. The board might ignore one woman's complaint, but they could not ignore data. Yet beneath that determination, something else stirred. It wasn't just about the trash anymore. It was about respect. The new neighbor had exposed a truth I hadn't wanted to see. The balance I'd maintained for years was fragile, dependent on fear and conformity, not real care. I realized how quickly order dissolves when no one enforces it. That thought frightened me more than the litter ever could. Each candy wrapper felt like a message, Each soda can like a personal dare. I began waking earlier, watching from the window with my coffee, scanning for movement. My mornings became patrols. My peace turned to obsession. Neighbors started to notice. They waved less, whispered more. I could see curtains flutter when I passed. Some thought I had lost my mind, that I was overreacting. They didn't see the pattern, the small details that pointed to defiance. They didn't hear the laughter late at night when her children threw plastic cups over the fence. To them, it was just trash. To me, it was a declaration of war disguised as carelessness. Still, I smiled in public, nodding at everyone, pretending not to care. But each step I took through my immaculate yard was a reminder of what I was fighting to protect. By the end of the month, I no longer needed to look for the garbage. It found me. Every day something new appeared: a half-eaten apple, a ripped newspaper, an empty yogurt cup. It was like a ritual, one I was forced to clean. The repetition broke something inside me. I stopped sending emails. I stopped expecting anyone to care. The HOA's silence had become approval, and her defiance had become routine. Standing there one afternoon, holding a torn plastic bag dripping with coffee grounds, I finally understood the smell that had haunted me from the start. It wasn't the trash. It was the smell of disrespect, and it had been rotting this neighborhood long before she moved in. That realization was the beginning of my transformation. I would no longer be the woman who complained. I would be the one who acted. I wiped my hands, threw the bag into her bin, and looked at the house that had disturbed my peace. A plan began to form, slow and deliberate. Order would return not through the HOA, not through rules, but through me. The woman who brought chaos would soon learn that some of us were built for battle, even if it starts with something as small as a piece of trash. Politeness was my armor, and I believed it could solve anything. My mother taught me that respect begins with handwriting, that a note written carefully could change hearts where shouting could not. So I wrote one on my best paper, asking my neighbor to respect the property line and to please close her bins. I taped it to her door before sunrise, proud of my patience. Later that morning, I saw her peel it off, read it, smile in that slow, deliberate way that said she knew exactly what she was doing, and drop it into her bin with her trash. The sound of the lid closing echoed through the still air like a door shutting on civility. I tried to laugh it off, but that small act stayed with me. It felt personal, deliberate, like she had thrown the note at me without using her hands. Days passed, and her bins kept overflowing. On windy mornings, my yard turned into a landfill. Napkins fluttered across my grass, cans rolled into the flowers I had planted with care, and greasy boxes stained the sidewalk. She never looked ashamed. She waved at people as if nothing had happened, as if her trash were part of the scenery. I watched her from my kitchen window, jaw tight, telling myself she was testing how far she could go. The more I cleaned, the more she dumped. It became a rhythm of humiliation. I wrote to the HOA, listing every incident, attaching photos with dates and times. The reply was short and hollow. They said they would look into it. They never did. At dinner, my husband told me to let it go. He said it was just trash, that I was making it bigger than it was. I wanted to scream, but I smiled instead. Men never understand that a woman's home is her reflection. When someone dirties it, they dirty her. I could not let it go. Letting go is for people who do not care, and I cared too much. The next morning, I printed the HOA cleanliness rule, highlighted the section about bins, and slipped it under her door with another note. This one was shorter and unsigned. She stuffed it into my mailbox, shredded into strips. I stood on the driveway staring at those pieces fluttering in the breeze, and I felt something in me settle into focus. I decided to bring it to the next HOA meeting. I arrived early, folder in hand, ready to speak. They discussed budgets and flowers before letting me talk. When I finally did, I showed the photos, the rules, the violations. The president of the board, who had never once trimmed his own hedge, laughed and said maybe I should buy a bigger bin. The room chuckled. I sat back down, smiling so tightly it hurt. That laugh echoed louder than the wind in my yard. It was the moment I understood that this community respected noise, not order. They mistook control for cruelty, standards for arrogance. I left the meeting feeling invisible. That night, I walked through the neighborhood alone. The streetlights flickered over uncollected bins, sagging fences, and forgotten toys. People had grown lazy, careless, unbothered. I took notes of every violation. They wanted to call me obsessive, but obsession is only a word used by the untidy to describe the disciplined. I knew the rules by heart. I enforced them silently. My flashlight cut through the darkness like truth through denial. When I returned home, I stood in front of the mirror and told myself I was not the problem. I was the cure. Over the next days, I documented everything. Each piece of trash became a photograph. Each morning, I inspected the perimeter of my yard. My husband began to sigh every time I picked up the camera, but I ignored him. Every can, every wrapper was evidence. People can lie, but data cannot. I was building a record no one could dismiss. And yet the more I recorded, the more I saw how little anyone cared. She continued smiling, tossing her garbage like breadcrumbs across the grass. Her children kicked soda bottles down the street. Sometimes I thought I heard them laughing at me behind the fence, but when I looked, there was only silence and the smell of waste. I started waking earlier, checking the bins before dawn. I felt like a watchtower guarding a border. There was satisfaction in control, even if that control came from anger. The neighbors began to whisper. They said I was too strict, too controlling, too everything. They wanted me silent because silence keeps disorder comfortable. I ignored them. I had found my purpose again. The trash became proof of what happens when people lose respect for where they live. Then came the morning that changed everything. I stepped outside with my gloves ready, expecting another mess. The sun was bright, the air still, and there, at the edge of my lawn, was a single note taped to a crushed soda can. It said, "Thank you for cleaning." No signature, no name, just that. It was her handwriting. My pulse quickened. It was mockery disguised as gratitude. I crushed the can in my hand and threw it into my bin. At that moment, I stopped caring about rules or meetings or what the HOA thought of me. I wanted justice, personal and undeniable. That afternoon, I stood in front of my window and watched her yard. She left her bins open again, leaning back in her chair like a queen surveying her kingdom. I felt the fury rise, calm and clean. That was when the plan began forming. The polite version of me had failed. The reasonable woman had been ignored. It was time to let the other part of me take over, the part that believed discipline was not a request, but a command. My notes and niceties had been trampled under garbage, but I would not stay buried there. I had learned that kindness only matters to people capable of shame, and shame was a language she would never understand. By the time the sky darkened, my decision was made. I would no longer wait for the HOA to act. I would no longer write notes or ask for help. I would use their own rules, their own structure, and turn it against them. I went to my desk, opened my laptop, and began researching surveillance systems. If they would not see what I saw, I would make them see it. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The war for order had only just begun. Public embarrassment is a peculiar furnace where humiliation becomes molten and forges new resolution. The board's casual dismissal of my complaint acted like a spark tossed into dry tinder. I had prepared photographs with dates and times and compiled a steady record of small offenses that together formed a clear pattern. They had listened politely, then returned to their coffee as if decorum were a topic for leisure rather than urgency. While I knelt to remove a plastic bag caught among the roses, I saw her on the porch with a glass and a smile that felt like performance. Her ease in that moment sharpened the sting of being dismissed by the people entrusted to maintain this neighborhood. The sting turned into focus, and focus turned into planning because anger without direction is only pain. I read the bylaws the way others read novels, trying to find meaning in the margins, and discovered language that required action when violations occurred. If the board would not act out of conscience, I would force accountability through evidence so public that ignoring it would no longer be an option. I rehearsed my words and the order in which I would present the facts to make sure emotion did not derail clarity. I documented wind patterns and garbage trajectories because intent can appear as accident when the right conditions are ignored. I learned how to frame images so the camera would show what my eyes had seen without offering interpretation that could be dismissed as bias. I consulted a neighbor who owned a small security shop and learned how discreet placement would yield indisputable footage. The equipment had to be legal and unobtrusive, and its results had to stand up to the scrutiny of a board meeting and perhaps a municipal clerk. I placed the device where the view swept the property line and the bins, and the patch of lawn where litter repeatedly gathered. I did not post anything online or share clips prematurely because timing and context would determine the impact of the evidence. Each clip recorded a small ritual of carelessness, a repeated behavior that by itself might be forgiven, but together became pattern and proof. I labeled every file with date and time and compiled them into a sequence that told the story more effectively than emotion could. When I presented the files at the HOA office, the president's laughter faltered and the room cooled because an image that does not need words speaks with authority. The board could no longer casually shrug because the footage removed ambiguity and demanded response by virtue of its clarity. What had felt like private disgrace shifted into a public conversation about leadership and responsibility and the ability of authority to enforce its own standards. The impact was not instantaneous, but it was inexorable because public evidence creates pressure in a way that polite requests cannot. I watched faces change as the clips played from late evening into small hours of the night when the porch lights glowed and bins remained open. I realized that the humiliation I had felt was a tool the community could use to correct itself if only its leaders would choose to act. The board convened a hearing, and neighbors who had once ignored my polite notes now had to reckon with visual proof in hard light. The woman next door found herself at the center of attention in a way she had orchestrated for herself by flaunting the rules. Her amusement curdled into discomfort as the footage rolled, and her composure weakened under the gravity of impartial recording. The humiliation was effective because it was not me who judged it, but the unblinking eye of documentation that left little room for story crafting. People who had previously shrugged now spoke about standards and compliance and the importance of setting an example for children. The president who had laughed offered apologies that sounded like explanations and then like promises that would be tested by follow-up. Once evidence becomes public, leaders either respond or reveal that their authority is performative and without teeth. I had not set out to shame someone for sport, but to restore a basic level of respect and to demonstrate that rules are meaningful when enforced. The camera did not replace civility, but it exposed a breakdown in communal care and forced a choice between neglect and action. In the days that followed, enforcement measures were proposed and fines were discussed because the board could not afford to appear indifferent. The woman who had once waved from her porch now kept a nervous vigilance and began closing her bins without being prompted. Neighbors who had looked away began to tidy their corners and to ask how they could help restore order without recrimination. My role in the situation changed from victim to catalyst because I had translated private irritation into public record, and that shifted responsibility. I felt a complicated satisfaction not from seeing someone embarrassed, but from watching a system that had been static begin to move toward repair. There was a humbling element to witnessing the power of documentation because it proved that persistence paired with methodical effort can alter dynamics. I recognize that humiliation has ethical hazards and that wielding it requires a steady conscience and a clear aim toward restitution rather than revenge. I vowed to keep my actions oriented toward community well-being and not toward personal vindication because that boundary mattered. The board instituted clearer guidelines and assigned a small committee to monitor repeated infractions and to report back monthly. They established a simple and transparent process, and victims of neglect no longer lacked a channel through which to be heard. The woman next door accepted a mediation meeting and agreed to basic steps to secure her bins and to supervise her children when they played near property lines. Her cooperation was imperfect at first, but then gradually consistent as the consequences of public scrutiny settled into routine behavior. I felt relief, but remained watchful because cultural change is a slow tide, not a sudden flood, and old habits return without maintenance. The episode taught me that leadership sometimes requires stepping out of polite roles and taking action that others will later call necessary and reasonable. I had learned how to gather proof, how to craft a narrative of facts, and how to present it in a way that compelled accountability. The whole street breathed easier as small infractions diminished and people spoke more openly about mutual obligations. My relationship with neighbors shifted from performative civility to pragmatic cooperation, and that felt both awkward and promising. I was no longer merely a keeper of hedges, but someone who had helped restore the community's trust in its own rules. Humiliation had been the catalyst, but the lasting effect was repair and a renewed sense of responsibility that extended beyond my yard. Small acts of war rarely begin as warfare. They begin as self-defense disguised as habit, a little gesture here, a small correction there, the slow reassertion of control in a world that refuses to acknowledge your discipline. The morning after the board meeting, I woke before sunrise and stood by the window watching her bins glisten with dew. They sat there open like mouths waiting to swallow the next insult. I walked outside with a single bag of my own household trash, perfectly tied, and placed it near her fence as if I had forgotten it. It looked casual, harmless, accidental, yet deliberate enough to make a statement. Later that day, when I saw her drag the bag across her driveway with a look of confusion and disgust, I felt a calm satisfaction spread through me like warmth. I had reclaimed a sliver of power that no one could take from me. The next morning, I carried out the smallest portion of coffee grounds from my bin and scattered them into hers while she was away. It was nothing that would ruin her day, but enough to stain her illusion of superiority. She had treated cleanliness as a joke. I would make her live inside the mess she created. There was an elegance in that balance, a private form of justice that did not need witnesses. Every act had purpose. Each time she bent down to clean or frowned at the sight of something misplaced, it reminded me that she was capable of discomfort, that she could feel what she had made me feel for weeks. Power, even petty power, has a flavor that lingers. It does not shout. It hums quietly under the skin, a private pulse of control that grows stronger with every small victory. I had always thought of myself as reasonable, yet reason had done nothing to protect my order. Politeness had been mistaken for weakness. Now, subtle retaliation became my new language. I timed my gardening so the scent of fresh fertilizer drifted toward her patio right before she hosted guests. I trimmed the hedge between us with precision so that clippings landed neatly on her side, forcing her to bend and pick them up if she wanted tidiness. These were not crimes. They were lessons, gentle corrections designed to teach her that disrespect has consequences. At first it felt satisfying in a way that words cannot fully describe. I would glance out the window and see her scowling as she brushed away the stray leaves or shook her broom at the fence line. Watching her react filled the void the HOA had left in me. It made me feel seen again, even if my recognition came from quiet rebellion instead of applause. I began to realize that I was not only restoring balance, but reshaping the hierarchy of our small world. For once, she was responding to my actions instead of ignoring my existence. The symmetry of it was intoxicating. Days turned into weeks, and the routine became ritual. Each morning, I found a new way to remind her of my presence. Sometimes it was a single banana peel tossed close enough to her bin to blur ownership. Sometimes it was a perfectly swept driveway that made the stray litter in hers look exaggerated. My revenge was invisible to everyone else, yet perfectly visible to her. It required patience and precision, two qualities she lacked. I was orchestrating a silent education, and she was my reluctant pupil. But control is a fragile thing. The more I exercised it, the more it consumed me. I began waking earlier, pacing by the window, scanning for her car, anticipating her movements. What had begun as strategy started to feel like obsession. I told myself it was about justice, yet I caught myself smiling each time I imagined her annoyance. My husband noticed my early mornings and restless nights. He asked if something was wrong, and I told him I was simply managing the garden. He nodded, uninterested, unaware that my garden had become a battlefield. There was a morning when I saw her through the window, wiping her porch railings with quick, angry motions. The sight pleased me at first, then unsettled me. I wondered if she sensed what I was doing, or if she simply felt the shift in power without understanding its source. Either way, the silence between us thickened. We stopped waving. We stopped pretending. The air itself seemed to hold our mutual defiance. I realized how deeply I had let her presence shape my days, how much space she occupied in my thoughts. Yet I could not stop. The taste of small victory had replaced the bitterness of humiliation. My neighbors began to notice subtle changes. They saw me outside more often, tending to the roses with near military precision, aligning each bin on collection day like a formation of soldiers. They smiled politely, perhaps relieved that my anger had found a new outlet. None of them guessed that I had become the quiet architect of an undeclared war. There was pleasure in their ignorance. I no longer needed approval or sympathy. What mattered was that the woman next door no longer smirked so freely when she saw me. Revenge, I discovered, is not only about what you do, but how invisibly you do it. The best victories leave no fingerprints, only the echo of confusion in the mind of your opponent. I wanted her to wonder if the coffee grounds were accident or message, if the misplaced bag was coincidence or warning. That uncertainty became my weapon. She started checking her yard more often, walking around her bins twice before leaving for work. Each time she did, I felt my pulse slow, my breathing steady. The control was working. Still, I began to sense that the satisfaction was fading, replaced by an emptiness that felt heavier than the rage that had started it all. I stood one afternoon holding a rake, staring at the perfectly clean path between our properties, and felt neither victory nor peace. I had become too accustomed to conflict. My small acts of war had created a silence that was no longer restful but expectant. I began to wonder how far I would go if provoked again. Would I escalate, or had I already gone too far? The thought lingered like smoke in the back of my mind. She must have felt it too, that charged quietness hanging between us. For a week no new trash appeared, and I almost missed it. I found myself peering out the window waiting for the next excuse to act. When none came, I realized how deeply the battle had defined me. I had built my days around opposition. I wanted her to yield, yet I needed her defiance to keep my purpose alive. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the houses, I saw her standing on her porch with her arms folded, staring at my yard. There was no smirk this time, only exhaustion mirrored back at me. We stood in that strange standoff for several seconds before she turned away and closed her door. I remained there under the fading light, holding my gloves, wondering if victory always felt so hollow. I had won the small battles, but in winning them, I had become what I once despised. That night, lying in bed, I thought about the word manners. I had believed I was teaching her some, but maybe I was teaching myself the cost of policing them. Power, even petty power, can change the texture of a soul. I drifted to sleep listening to the quiet outside, wondering if peace would ever return to this street, or if we had both forgotten what it sounded like. The first time I saw the red light, I thought it was a reflection. It blinked faintly in the evening haze, barely visible against the white paint of her porch. Then I noticed another near the mailbox, small and deliberate, not a trick of sunlight, but an eye staring back. Cameras. The realization settled over me slowly, crawling up my spine with the cold certainty of exposure. I stood in my living room, blinds half drawn, heart pulsing hard enough to feel through my fingertips. She had been quiet for days, too quiet, and now I understood why. The hunter had become the hunted. That night, I could not sleep. Every creak of the house sounded like a shutter clicking, every glint on the window like another red, aimed at me. I kept replaying my own petty victories in my mind, the coffee grounds, the misplaced bag, the little reminders I had scattered across her piece. They felt different now, stripped of their satisfaction and replaced with dread. She had learned from me, adapted, and weaponized my own obsession. I had set the tone for war, and she had raised the stakes. Morning came heavy and slow. I made coffee with trembling hands and tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Then my phone pinged. The HOA group chat flashed across the screen with cheerful punctuation. The message sat there glowing in the small hours of sunlight, bright and mocking. Good morning, everyone caught last night's litter culprit. I opened the image without breathing. There I was, Frozen mid-step, robe draped over my shoulders, slippers sinking into the damp grass, a trash bag in my hand. The security footage was crisp and clear, the timestamp undeniable. My face, the same one that had argued about neighborhood standards, stared back at me from every phone in the community. I felt my stomach drop. 17 comments followed before noon. Some were jokes, others disbelief, all of them carrying the sting of humiliation. People who had ignored me for months now had something to say. They wrote about irony and hypocrisy, about how even the loudest defenders of order could stumble. My name became a punchline disguised as concern. I scrolled through the thread with shaking fingers, reading my reputation unravel in real time. The betrayal burned deeper than the exposure itself. She had done what I had done, but with more precision. She had learned my language and used it better than I ever could. I had turned surveillance into power, and she had turned it into punishment. I sat there staring at my reflection on the phone screen, unable to decide whether I was angry at her or at myself. The humiliation was pure and electric, coursing through me with each vibration of the phone as another message arrived. I wanted to vanish, to walk out of this house and never look back at the faces that had once smiled at me. But vanishing is not my nature. I closed the curtains, silenced the phone, and sat in the dim room listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. The world outside continued without me, yet inside everything had shifted. For the first time, I understood how she must have felt when I had made her life smaller through quiet control. It was not justice she wanted. It was balance. I had taken her dignity, and she had taken mine. By afternoon, the neighborhood felt different. I could sense the stares even through the walls, a collective curiosity pressing against my home like fog. I ventured outside once, only to see two women whispering by the corner of the street. They stopped when they saw me, offering tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes. The trash bin stood at perfect right angles along the curb, a mockery of the order I had once enforced. My empire of cleanliness had become my prison. Still, something inside me refused to accept defeat. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the bylaws once again, flipping through pages that now read like accusations. Every rule I had cited, every line I had underlined, now pointed at me. I realized that the HOA chat had given her the validation I had long craved. She had turned my community into her audience. My humiliation had become their entertainment. Yet deep beneath the shame was a flicker of understanding. She had beaten me at my own game, and I could either crumble or evolve. That evening I stepped onto my porch and looked directly at the small red light. It blinked once, steady and silent. I felt anger, but also a strange admiration. She had learned quickly. The student had outgrown the teacher. I walked back inside, my mind already reshaping the narrative. Revenge is not about striking back in anger. It is about reclaiming control through patience. I would not retaliate with noise. I would let the silence work in my favor. The days that followed were long and quiet. I avoided the chat entirely. The fewer words I spoke, the faster the story faded. Gossip burns bright but dies fast without oxygen. Slowly, attention shifted elsewhere. Another neighbor received a citation for uncut grass, and the chat found new prey. The heat of my embarrassment cooled, leaving behind something harder, more precise. I had been publicly exposed, but I had also been freed. No one expected perfection from me anymore. The pressure to perform civility was gone. I began to see the street differently. The same people who had laughed at me were still careless in their own ways, still leaving bins ajar, still letting wrappers blow into the gutters. Their moral superiority had the lifespan of a morning breeze. The woman next door had proven her point, yet she, too, had lost something. I noticed her porch light dimmed more often, her laughter rarer. Cameras give power, but they also imprison those who watch. She had trapped herself in vigilance. One afternoon, I caught her sweeping the driveway, moving slower than usual. Our eyes met briefly across the hedge. Neither of us smiled. There was no triumph left, only fatigue. The war had taken both of us, reshaped us into reflections of one another. I returned to my house and sat by the window, watching the light fade over the rooftops. For the first time in months, I felt the urge to stop fighting. The humiliation had turned into something quieter, almost useful. It had burned away the illusion that control keeps peace. The truth was simpler and far less elegant. Order is only sustainable when it is shared, not imposed. I had fought for harmony and created discord. She had fought for dignity and created exposure. We had both lost more than we had won. Yet, in that loss was clarity. When the next HOA meeting arrived, I attended without a folder, without notes, without evidence. I sat in the back and listened as others complained about parking and lighting. No one mentioned me. The silence felt like mercy. I realized that revenge, when it circles back, is not a punishment from others but a reflection of yourself. I had built the very mirror that exposed me. I walked home through the quiet street, the red lights still glowing faintly on her porch. They no longer frightened me. They simply reminded me of what happens when pride replaces grace. I closed my door, exhaled slowly, and let the stillness fill the house. For the first time since this began, I allowed the mess to exist outside of me instead of within. The cameras could watch all they wanted. I had nothing left to hide. After the video went around, I stopped leaving the house. Eyes on me felt like a weight pressing against the front door, and I began to measure my world in steps from threshold to porch. Neighbors crossed the sidewalk to avoid passing close, and conversations that once included me fell silent when I entered the room. Someone taped a mocking label to my mailbox and left it like a public accusation. The house that had been a refuge tightened into a small territory watched by a community with soft curiosity and cautious distance. My husband asked me to apologize and to make gestures that might soothe the neighborhood. He wanted pie and soft words and a return to ordinary routines. I resisted because apology in that moment would have felt like surrender and erasing years of work and care. Pride had roots in the hours I spent trimming hedges, organizing cleanups, and writing newsletters. To confess would have been to reduce that history to a single embarrassing clip. Guilt is simple, but pride is complicated, and it kept me from offering an easy amends that would have felt performative and false. I began inventing alternate explanations for the footage. I pictured tampering and clever editing and thought maybe timestamps had been shifted. The mind builds defenses when it needs shelter, and I lived for weeks inside scenarios that absolved me of intentionality. If the neighborhood wanted a villain, I would not allow someone else to cast the role without my consent. I kept watch at odd hours, listening for footsteps, and became keenly aware of ordinary sounds that might become evidence in the wrong story. The house felt both smaller and louder as vigilance replaced ease. Isolation altered my habits. I stopped attending meetings and declined offers to help with events because public spaces felt like arenas. I wrote letters I never sent, cataloging contributions and sacrifices that did not need approval but served as memory anchors for myself. These unsent pages steadied me and reminded me that a single failing moment does not nullify years of care. I also looked for allies among quiet neighbors and found a few who remembered details that supported my view and were willing to speak privately about what they had seen. Blame spread quickly and gained gravity from repetition. Someone else's retelling made the clip larger and truer than it had been. I heard whispers in grocery aisles and at bus stops, as if narrative could reshape a person simply by being said often enough. Rumors hardened into judgments, and the community began to treat me as if the image on the screen contained my whole truth. That compression of identity felt brutal and unfair and made me withdraw further into the work of documenting my own days. The strain reached into the marriage in ways I had not expected. My husband tried to be practical, offering small conciliatory gestures and plans about how to repair the damage. His ideas felt naive because they assumed the wound could be smoothed rather than understood. Our conversations grew cautious and measured, and the space between us became a quiet place where neither of us wanted to trespass. I realized that pride can protect and also isolate, and that rebuilding would require steps that balanced humility and insistence. I started collecting evidence that told my side. I wrote dates and times, recorded weather conditions, and gathered photos of the mornings I had spent cleaning after windstorms. I spoke to neighbors who witnessed small incidents and assembled a modest file of corroboration. That work was methodical and steady, and it gave me a sense of agency. Reframing the story was not about revenge, but about restoring context so that one clip could not define the entirety of a life. Slowly the currents shifted. The fervor around the video cooled and others returned to their routines. A neighbor who had once smiled at my expense told me privately that they had noticed repeated carelessness about bins and asked if I would be willing to share my records with the board. The municipal office acknowledged my complaint and requested follow-up. It was not a theatrical victory, but it reopened a pathway toward accountability. The label on my mailbox remained as a petty scar, but its sting diminished with time. Reclaiming trust took patience and required showing up in small ways without grand declarations. I walked my block again, greeting people and listening more than speaking. I attended meetings with facts rather than heat and offered practical suggestions for clear enforcement. People responded to steadiness and evidence, and over time the pattern of avoidance loosened. Some neighbors reached out with quiet apologies and others simply resumed civilities. The work of repair was incremental and sometimes awkward, but it began to stitch together a quieter daily life. In the end, I learned that blame can be corrosive when left alone, but fragile when met with clarity. I learned that pride had both protected me and boxed me in, and that the path forward required making room for humility without surrendering truth. I kept the house as a place of care, while also holding evidence of my efforts, and the community slowly remembered that a life built over years cannot be erased by a single screen. I emerged changed but not broken, carrying lessons about vigilance, patience, and the cost of policing others while also holding a steadier confidence in my right to defend the place I helped build now. The next HOA meeting was overflowing with people who wanted a show. I arrived early, carrying a thick stack of papers clutched against my chest like armor. The murmur of voices softened as I walked in, the same neighbors who had once whispered about me now falling silent with uneasy curiosity. Every seat was filled, faces lit by the same mixture of guilt and fascination that always accompanies gossip exposed. I could feel their eyes tracing my steps as I took a seat at the front, calm and deliberate, the weight of my evidence resting heavily in my hands. I had spent nights preparing these pages, printing screenshots of violations I had documented over months. Each page was a mirror they had avoided looking into, and tonight I would hold it up for everyone to see. When the meeting began, the board tried to maintain order, pretending the agenda was still about landscaping budgets and maintenance schedules. I waited patiently, hands folded, until the moment came when the floor was opened for concerns. Then I stood and laid the stack on the table with a quiet finality that cut through the noise. The sound of paper meeting would made the room still. I began speaking slowly, carefully, my voice steady and measured. I called each name without accusation, describing violations exactly as written in the bylaws. One by one, I pointed to the evidence: unregistered holiday lights strung past curfew, bins left open overnight, fences never repainted after notice. With every example, the air thickened with discomfort. I was not angry anymore. Anger had burned itself out long before that night. What remained was something colder and sharper, a sense of justice no one could dismiss as hysteria or spite. The very rules they had used to humiliate me now turned against them, line by line, photograph by photograph. The president of the board cleared his throat several times, trying to interrupt, but the weight of my composure kept him silent. The room filled with shifting bodies, tapping fingers, and the sound of shame settling into every corner. When I finally finished, the silence that followed was deeper than any applause. The same neighbors who had mocked me in the chat now stared down at their laps, cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Some muttered excuses, others offered quiet apologies, but none dared meet my eyes for long. I did not need to raise my voice or demand respect. The documents spoke for themselves. They revealed how fragile reputations truly were and how easily the system they had trusted could turn on them once someone chose to enforce it without fear. By the end of the night, the board had no choice but to act. They voted unanimously to dissolve the HOA group chat, citing privacy concerns and community tension. It was their way of surrendering without saying the words. As the room emptied, I gathered my papers with slow precision, savoring the silence that had once humiliated me and now belonged to me. Order, at last, was restored. Not through kindness, not through understanding, but through accountability that felt like justice. Fear was the price they paid for the order they had broken, and I was no longer the woman they whispered about, but the one they quietly obeyed. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood returned to its rhythm of trimmed lawns and quiet stairs. The woman next door waves now whenever she sees me. Her smile is polite, almost friendly, the kind that hides unease. She believes the war ended in her favor, that the silence between us is surrender. I let her think that. Control often works best when it looks like concession. My yard remains flawless, not a leaf out of place, not a single piece of litter daring to cross its border. People pass by slower than before, glancing, pretending not to. My name travels through their whispers, never spoken directly, but always present, hovering like perfume after a storm. I stopped explaining myself long ago. Power needs no justification when it has already proven itself. I realized that revenge does not roar. It hums beneath the surface, steady and certain. The victory was never about humiliation or applause, but about reclaiming narrative. They had tried to turn me into a joke, a caricature, a woman obsessed with order. I embraced it. Obsession brought structure, and structure brought peace. They still call me HOA Karen, though not to my face. I hear it behind closed doors, in the careful tone people use when they fear the person they describe. I do not mind. Titles lose their sting when worn with pride. Let them call me what they will. I am the one who restored the rules, who turned ridicule into respect. My garden blooms brighter now, the cleanest on the street, the quiet proof that I won without needing to raise my voice.